As an African, I stand here as one of the trumpet voices of Africa, a continent all too often treated with affable indifference. Africa's voice is not heard. This United Nations cannot be truly international. It cannot be truly together.
Botswana's president took the United Nations stage and delivered a speech that didn't beg, didn't bow, and didn't pander. It was a firestorm of truth, slicing through decades of diplomatic niceties like a blade through velvet. For too long, Africa has been expected to deliver polite speeches, grateful nods to foreign donors, promises to do better, and pleas for inclusion. But this wasn't that. This was a declaration of independence, a demand for respect, and a warning to the world. Africa is done playing the victim. The continent is rising, not to ask for a seat at the table, but to build its own, a new African diplomacy. The president's words were not a request for aid. They were a manifesto for transformation. Our vision is clear, he said, to diversify our economy, empower our people, and create resilience. This wasn't a pitch for charity. It was a call for partnership. He invited the world to invest in renewable energy, technology, sustainable agriculture, and value-added industries, not as saviors but as equals. The message was unmistakable. If you want to engage with Africa, come as a collaborator, not a predator. The days of exploiting Africa's resources and selling back finished goods at exorbitant prices are over. Trade now comes without tribute. For decades, Africa has been trapped in a cycle of humiliation masquerading as international cooperation. Western nations arrived with promises of development, but their aid often built dependencies, not progress. Loans came wrapped in velvet, only to strangle economies with fine print. When Africa dared to rise, it was labeled unstable. When it spoke out, it was called angry. But Botswana's president shattered that narrative. His speech wasn't about seeking approval. It was about demanding accountability. The open hand he extended was not one of need, but a handshake of sovereignty. Respect our sovereignty, he seemed to say, or watch us build without you. The West's fear. Africa's potential. What unsettles the West isn't Africa's poverty. It's Africa's potential. A continent with 60% of the world's arable land, a youthful population, and nearly all the minerals needed for the Green Revolution is waking up to its worth. That worth is dangerous to those who have profited from Africa's silence. The president spoke of resilience, but not as endurance, resilience as evolution. Africa has learned from centuries of betrayal. Colonization taught exploitation, independence brought disappointment, and now necessity is forging power. The continent is no longer a project to be managed, it's a precedent to be set. The West's hypocrisy is glaring. Nations that lecture Africa on fiscal discipline drown in their own debt. Those that warn against corruption bail out their banks with public funds. Yet they dare call themselves developed. Developed at what? Hypocrisy, perhaps. Botswana's speech wasn't just for the UN. It was for Africans at home. It declared, "You are not helpless. You are the future they fear." That single truth turned a diplomat. Surviving the desert, defying the odds. Botswana, a semi-arid nation, knows scarcity intimately. Its people understand the weight of drought, the anxiety of empty water drums, the sight of wilting crops under a relentless sun. Climate change is not a distant threat, the president said. It is a present reality. These words carry the weight of history and grief. Africa didn't create this crisis. It contributes less than 4% of global emissions, yet it bears the brunt of its consequences. The same nations that industrialized on Africa's resources now demand the continent halt development to save the planet. The audacity is staggering. Pollute for centuries, then preach purity to the victims. Botswana's call for investment in water infrastructure, early warning systems, and climate-smart agriculture wasn't a plea. It was a demand for justice. Climate reparations aren't radical. They're overdue. The carbon footprint choking the skies came from European factories, not African farms. You can't burn down the house and then scold the tenants for sweating. Yet Africa isn't waiting for apologies. From Morocco's Noor solar complex, the world's largest, to Kenya's geothermal plants and Namibia's green hydrogen projects, the continent is innovating where others only theorize. The desert didn't break Africa, it made it visionary. Scarcity birthed innovation, teaching Africans to grow food in sand, harness energy from wind, and find hope in hardship. Health is freedom. Earlier this year, Botswana faced a shortage of essential medicines, exposing the fragility of global health systems. Access to medicine is a human right, not a privilege, the president declared. This wasn't just a policy statement. It was a rebellion against a system that turns health into a commodity. The global health industry isn't about compassion. It's a brutal business. Life-saving drugs are assets, diseases are markets, and desperation drives profits. When Botswana's hospitals ran dry, the developed world didn't rush to help. They were too busy protecting patents. Intellectual property, they call it. Africans call it greed. The president's call for local production and regional supply hubs wasn't just about logistics. It was about dismantling dependency. When Africa produces its own vaccines, it doesn't just save lives, it breaks an empire. During COVID-19, Western nations hoarded vaccines while Africa buried its dead. They vaccinated pets before African doctors. Yet they called Africa unprepared. From South Africa's mRNA hubs to Rwanda's vaccine plants, the continent is cutting the cords of reliance. Soon, the same nations guarding their patents will buy from African factories. A seat at the table, or a new table entirely. The president's boldest moment came when he addressed the UN Security Council's Permanent Five. Africa's voice is not heard, he said, demanding a permanent seat for the continent. The room froze. Diplomats shuffled papers, interpreters faltered. He had broken the unspoken rule of global diplomacy. Don't speak the truth too loudly. For 80 years, the UN has claimed to represent the world while excluding 1/5 of it. Africa, home to 1.4 billion people, has no permanent voice on the Security Council. The same nations that looted its wealth and drew its borders still dictate its fate. They call it global order. Africa calls it colonialism with microphones. The UN loves to talk reform, but only if it means rearranging chairs, not redistributing power. The Permanent Five, US, UK, France, Russia, China, nodded politely, knowing they'd veto any real change. But Africa is done waiting. The African Union is growing stronger, BRICS is expanding, and the African Continental Free Trade Area is uniting economies. A new architecture is rising, one that doesn't need New York's approval. The West calls this dangerous because an Africa that speaks for itself threatens those who profit from its silence. The dawn of African reckoning. Botswana's speech wasn't just defiance, it was prophecy. The next time Africa comes to the UN, it won't beg for inclusion. It will announce a new table, built in Africa, for Africa by Africa. The world order built on Africa's suffering is cracking. The gold once stolen now backs African banks. The sun once ignored now powers African grids. The soil once looted feeds African industries. The empire is running out of Africa to exploit, and it doesn't know how to function without it. This is the age of African reckoning, not vengeance but value. The continent that powered colonial revolutions is now building its own. From Ouagadougou to Addis Ababa, a quiet unity is forming, not just political but psychological. Africans no longer believe salvation lies elsewhere. That shift changes everything. Botswana's president didn't just speak for his nation. He spoke for every African tired of being a spectator in their own destiny. His words carried centuries of rage, cloaked in calm resolve. The West trembles not because Africa is weak, but because it's waking. African economies are outpacing Europe's. African innovation is surpassing Western investment. The powers that once sold progress are now borrowing it. The question isn't whether Africa will rise. It's what happens when it does. When Africa stops knocking and builds its own door, who will the West lecture then? The continent that was once called the future is no longer waiting. It's here on its own terms,